today to have Professor Ivan Schuler, a distinguished member of the Department of Physics, give the seminar today. If you haven't read the About the Speaker part on here, you should. And I clearly don't want to read the whole thing because that won't leave time for Ivan to give his talk. But briefly, he received his licenciado degree, that's much I can do in Spanish, from the University in Chile, and then came to Northwestern University, where he received his MS and PhD degree. He worked at Argonne National Laboratories before coming to UCSD, and he's a professor of physics there, here, I should say. Okay, he has lots and lots of honors, and which too many to say. I'll just mention one, the Humboldt Award, which I'm very familiar with. His scientific interests include the preparation, characterization, and study of metallic superlattices, heterostructures, and nanostructures. And I think I'm not going to bother reading all that to you. But in any event, he has a huge number of publications, and he also is one of the most cited researchers, both in physics and also in a much wider field. So, to keep brief, I will welcome Professor Schuler.
Okay, thanks a lot for coming. And what I want to say, since the audience is not extraordinarily big, please feel free to ask questions at any time. I'll be happy to answer them, and I'll finish on time. I'm very good at this, finishing on time. So you don't have to worry that you have to sit here for the next 4 hours. It's only 3 hours. Okay, so the work that I will tell you about is in collaboration with several people that from the University of California and people from Motorola. The one person that is still here is Igor Roshin, and much of the work that I'll tell you about was done by him. Johan Ackerman was here and now he's at Motorola. Chris Layton is at the University of Minnesota. Sihon Kim went to work for a company in Minneapolis, and I'm not sure what happened to him after that. And Aldo Romero is in Mexico now. Roberto Escudero spent a sabbatical here in my lab, and David Rapson used to be at the University of California, San Diego, and then they went to Florida, and then he continued working on this. He still, I think, continues working on similar problems. Javier Batle is here in sabbatical now, so you can. So this work started way before. Oh, the hell did I do? I give myself the time. The talk is over. Goodbye. I like to time myself, so I know that I'm on. So okay, now I could recover another 10 minutes for myself. From Motorola, there was a bunch of people that worked on this problem. Said Tehran is the man who's in charge of their MRAM program, and is the man that will probably get the MRAM program going. Okay, so of course, we have to acknowledge the people that give us the money, the Department of Energy, who's been supporting me for pretty much all my scientific life, and DARPA. Okay, so everybody knows about this already, but I just thought that for those few of you that don't know about this, let me just remind you about this business, this word that was invented by Stuart Wolf a few years ago, spintronics. Is electronic devices in which the direction of an electron spin is pointing is just as important as its charge. Okay, so this is, and basically all this business relies on the fact that if you have a normal material, then the two spin states have the same, they have a balanced Fermi surface. On the other hand, if you have a ferromagnetic material, there is an imbalance, and so there are some spins, say these down spins, there are more at the Fermi surface than there is up spins. And because of that, there is this phenomenon of spin bottleneck, which gives rise to magnetoresistance. This was actually what I will tell you about is, and I hope that I will convey you this, and I'm, of course, the right audience is not always there, I'm preaching to the choir, but there is two things that I want to leave here. Is one thing, maybe there's a few people that this will be a good lesson. And one thing is that basic research is very important and gives rise to applications that are totally unpredictable. And the research that I will tell you about is research that comes out from basic research It is not targeted research. It is not research that was aimed towards in a particular direction. That's number one. And number two, what I wanted to point out to you also is that another second sort of a role that we university professors anyhow have is to have people like for instance, Johan Ackerman, who now is at Motorola, actually doing applied work. So that's the second sort of a thing that I wanted to leave you. So in both, if you are interested in applications or you're interested in basic research is important and it pays. At the end, it does produce money, and so that's what I want to tell you. But however, it cannot be targeted. If you everything else is irrelevant. If you want to fall asleep at this stage of the game, it's okay with me. So let me show you what I'm talking about, what kind of important devices I'm talking about. Unless you're a very weird person, you have the devices that I will tell you about here in your own home. This is a read head. Every read head nowadays works on the principles in which I will tell you today and which I will discuss the physics of them today. And in fact, pretty soon, within probably a year, hopefully the magnetic random access memories which have been developed at Motorola will be in your telephones. They are very confident, and actually Casey Miller was there a week ago actually, and he tells me that they are even more confident now, right Casey? They're very confident that this will be in your telephones nowadays. Now it turns out that these kind of devices rely, basically, they are made out of a device that looks like this. It's a 4-layer device. There is an antiferromagnet, this is in principle, actually in practice it has more than 4 layers. But there is an antiferromagnet which has its spins alternating as you're going along, say, this direction here. Then that antiferromagnet provides a peeling for a ferromagnetic layer there, which has, let's say the spins pointing to the right here. And then there is a spacer of some sorts. And then there is what is called a free ferromagnet, which can rotate. And this is the basis for this device. The basis for this device is that basically there is 2 phenomena that are occurring here. One phenomenon that occurs is this exchange bias phenomenon, which is the phenomenon which occurs is the way that this antiferromagnet beams the ferromagnet. I won't tell you about that. This is actually called a spin valve. What I will tell you today is about these 3 layers here. The phenomenon that occurs in these 3 layers, which is basically the current that flows from this layer to that layer. And basically the way this device works is that if the 2 layers have the spins pointing in the same direction, the resistance is low, and if the 2 layers point in opposite direction, the resistance is high. That's it. That's the bottom line, the way this system operates. And so there is 2 interesting phenomena here: magnetic tunneling and exchange bias. And what I will focus on is this magnetic tunneling. Okay, so here's the concept. The concept is you have a barrier, quantum mechanical barrier. There is an electrode on this side, there is another electron on that side, and because of this weird thing of quantum mechanics, an electron that comes along here, it is able to tunnel through this barrier. It doesn't go above the barrier, it is able to go across the barrier. It can tunnel through the barrier. That's what quantum mechanics predicted, and this was already discovered by one of the physicists that got the least amount of publicity, well, not publicity, but certainly recognition in some ways, I think, is Oppenheimer, who keeps on appealing in all kind of situations, and actually track back this to a paper of, the first time that this was pointed out by Oppenheimer in 1928, to explain some properties of atoms. Okay? Well, you know, you can explain the properties of atoms in all kinds of ways, but there is probably many other ways of explaining properties of atoms, okay? So who knows whether this tunneling is really true, and there was a Fowler and Nordheim claim after that and explained some other properties. And this thing got really clinched when Geber came along in 1960, and he came up with, he was a graduate student, so you know, he was a really good graduate student, and he published this paper on his own without putting his professor name, so he got the Nobel Prize alone. Okay, so, you know, this really worried me. So here it is, but he came up with the following thing. He knew, because he was an engineer actually when he was a graduate student already, he knew that if he takes aluminum, and this is not a ferromagnetic metal, but if you take aluminum, and aluminum sort of naturally grows an oxide on it, right? And a very thin oxide, an insulating oxide of about 10 angstroms. So now what we are going to talk about is we are going to take a ferromagnetic material, grow a very thin 10 angstrom insulator on it, and put another ferromagnetic material and see how the tunneling occurs. And notice why am I talking that this is tunneling? Is because if this insulator is very thick, there is no current that is going to flow there. The only time there is current is when it is very thin and the electrons actually can pass through this barrier. Right? So that's what Geber discovered in 1960, and he got the Nobel Prize, I think, in 1972 or something. And so you wonder yourself, for 10 angstroms, if you think about it for a second, 10 angstroms, depending on what kind of material you're talking about, is 5 atoms. Talking about 5 atoms, that's very, very thin. And atoms are very, very small. So that's very, very little. And so what you do is you say, well, I'll spend a lot of money and I'll use molecular beam epitaxy. That's what a lot of people do. And so you can buy these very fancy looking machines that look like that. So if you want to see a machine that looks like that, you can come to my lab and you can see it, and Rafael Morales will be happy to show it to you. Okay, so that's what you do. You use a molecular beam epitaxy, you draw this thin layer, and that's it. Presumably. But of course, as soon as you say there is 5 atoms, then you start wondering, well, there's a bunch of questions that you can ask. Do you really have tunneling? I mean, just the fact that you see current through something that you think it is 10 angstrom, is it really that's what you have? So there is the issue whether you really see tunneling or there are pinholes there. The second issue is, what is the mechanism of this tunneling magnetoresistance? Of course, this is important for applications because if you have pinholes, and depending on the density of pinholes that you have in this tunnel junction, and if you make telephones or memories out of this, if you have a lot of pinholes or very little pinholes, it depends what's the minimum size that you can make of a tunnel junction. Okay? And then, of course, in order to improve the devices, suppose that all the effect comes from the fact that you have a pinhole, not the fact that it's tunneling. Then maybe you should worry about having more pinholes. And in fact, that's not completely crazy because there was this other whole issue that appeared all over the map starting in 1999, something called ballistic magnetoresistance, where people have taken 2 points, 2 magnetic points, and they touch them, presumably at a single atom contact, and they see this huge magnetoresistance. So think about it. You have a tunnel junction, there's these 5 atoms there, it has holes in it, and maybe the whole magnetoresistance comes from these contacts. So the issue whether the magnetoresistance comes from the contacts or comes from tunneling is a very important issue. Okay? And there is lots of papers on this, and I won't bore you with this, but there is, of course, there is always theories that can explain everything that you can find. So there is lots of theories that explain this ballistic magnetoresistance. And they see huge effects, and the effects are factors of 400, 3,000, they claim 3 million now. I mean, it's just like enormous. Okay, so there was a whole debate at the last March meeting, the last magnetism meeting about this. And this was a very heated debate, and the people were ready to kill each other about this thing, whether this phenomenon actually exists or it doesn't. So, okay, so here it is the issues that I want to talk about. Is I want to first establish how do we know that something is really tunneling, that it is in fact what I showed you, what Oppenheimer thought and what is the consequence of quantum mechanics, and then I want to look at the origin of the temperature dependence of the tunnel junction. You see, the reason I want to look at this is because there's all kind of exotic mechanisms that are being invoked, for instance, for the origin of the tunneling or the origin of the tunneling magnetoresistance. And so I want to see what does tunneling actually measure, what does this magnetic tunneling actually measure. That's sort of the purpose of this talk. Okay, so let me remind you again, what I have is I have this layer, this red layer of ferromagnet and another antiferromagnet separated here by a very thin oxide layer, and in our particular case it's going to be aluminum oxide, which is basically the only oxide that has been usefully used anywhere. In fact, for some reason aluminum or aluminium, as my English friends say, it's kind of unusual. Okay? So when you think about this, that you want to grow these 10 angstrom things, my wife actually, after we had our first child, you know, she was like 10 hours in labor, and then she said to me, you know, it is much easier to conceive than to deliver. Okay? So you can draw these nice, beautiful pictures like this, you know, 10 angstroms thick. The question is, what the hell does that mean? I mean, can you really make it? Right? And in fact, in a paper that Javier Butler wrote, it is said in another way. So there is oxide formation in other places besides where the oxide is deposited. Now this is, you know, nowadays many of the things that I will tell you are quite well accepted, but actually 4 years ago they were not. It was a big fight, and it was very hard to twist people's arm to believe that this in fact was happening. So what I want to tell you is that the deposition and the oxidation of this oxide is key here. And of course people, and you see there is a lot of work by other groups, so there is, you know, people have observed the barrier quality by microscopic observation in a variety of ways. There was some transport measurement. In fact, there was a transport measurement right here from Ed Price and you know, company. This guy, I don't know what he does now anymore. But, you know, they kind of, I think, as you will see during this talk, they came to some similar conclusions to what we came. Okay. So the idea is the following: is that you have this beautiful machine that every one of those screws costs $20, and the question is, does that can produce these 10 angstrom layers? And people remember the concept that they had is you have to produce this very thin barrier here that the electron goes through it, okay, and use molecular beam epitaxy, so this was what I told you that, well, it turns out that it's much easier to conceive than to deliver. Because the layers don't look like that. So that's what Geber thought they look like, but they don't look like that. They look more like this. And when things look more like this, then you can have shorts there. Right? And that's what I want to address. How do we know that we have shorts or we don't have shorts? So that's at least the first thing that we would like to address. Okay, so, but people of course say that we use the MB, so it must be right. So, you know, and so that I just want to tell this is something that I want to beat over the head, at least to my students, is that just because we have $1 million in a machine doesn't mean that it suddenly becomes some kind of a magic tool. Okay? You have to use the right tools to characterize the thing. After you do it, so I use molecular beam epitaxy and all these fancy things, but that doesn't matter. You still have to characterize what you have there. Now here it is where you see we immediately have a problem that actually was not commonly realized. And the problem is the following. Is if you look at the product of an aluminum oxide resistance times area junction product. So there's this junction that has an area and has a resistance. And you multiply the resistance times the area. The resistance that comes out to be, it turns out that the resistance area product is of the order of 10 to the 3rd to 10 to the 5th ohm micrometer squared. Okay? Well, if you ask yourself, well, what happens to the pin with a short? Well, a short, if you put in the numbers, you find out that the product of resistance times area is 10 to the minus 3 ohm micrometer squared. So think about it for an instant. You have one, very small, tiny little hole there that is a short. And that little hole has a resistance which is much, much lower than the resistance of this junction. So if you compare those two things, every time you have 10 to the minus 3 of these and 10 to the 5 of those, you'll have the same current going through the oxide. Half of the current will go to the oxide, half of the current will go to the junction. That is a very simple, trivial sort of a thing, right? These two resistors in parallel, right? So if you have one part in 10 to the 6 or 10 to the 8 is short, you're in trouble. Half of the current will go to the shorts. That's the thing that I want you to think about. This is what was not commonly realized, and as far as I was concerned, this was obvious to me. Okay? So basically, in one micrometer square, you have to find a short which is 1 angstrom squared. That's the bottom line. Okay, so think about it. You have to go with a microscope there, with an electron microscope, and you search for a sub-nanometer scale features over a micrometer range. Well, it's hopeless. So that's not the way to look for this. Actually, it's a wrong tool. It turns out that to look for things, usually you want to look with microscope, but it's not good for this one. Right? And so pinholes, looking for a pinhole is like looking for a needle in a haystack. It is literally like that. And so what you want to do is you want to do a right track. This is the right tool. The right tool is actually to measure the resistance of this thing. That's the right tool. Because you do the direct measurement on the final device, and I'll show you that you will be able to tell whether you have pinholes or you have tunneling. Directly, by looking at the fact. Okay, so this sounds like very brilliant. I invented this thing. Well, it turns out I didn't invent this thing. I did my thesis on tunneling, not magnetic tunneling, but superconducting tunneling. And it turns out I just looked at my briefcase and I pulled out all the tools that I was taught when I was a graduate student, and I reapplied them again. In superconducting tunneling, this was very easy, because if you had a superconductor in both sides of this junction, then it's very easy, because there is very clear signature of tunneling in the superconducting properties if the electrons are superconducting. For instance, you can look at the BCS density of states, you can look at phonon spectrum, you can look at Shapiro steps, all kinds of things. But we don't have any more superconductors. We have no ferromagnetic materials. That's what the problem is. Okay? So there's only 3 criteria which remain in normal state tunneling. You know, in the beginning, we started with 10 criteria. This man John Raoul, invented this tunneling criteria. He says, well, you have to, if you want to prove that something is tunneling, look at the BCS density of states, which looks something like this. Look at the phonon spectrum, look at the temperature dependence of the BCS density of states, look at the Shapiro steps, blah, 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 all these things. But they all rely on superconductivity except for 3. Okay? And the question is, which are those 3? So here are the 3. So what's left? And this is what the question that we want to answer first. What's left and what is reliable? Well, so people said the following, is you take a barrier and as you change the thickness of it, because it's a tunneling phenomenon, because you have a barrier which is very high, and as you change the thickness, the dependence has to be exponential. Just in case you fall asleep at every stage of the game, I'm going to tell you here. That's no good, actually. I'll show you that it's not a good criteria. And this has been invoked by some of my best friends. No good. Oh, I went too fast. Okay, so that's no good. Then there was a fit to tunneling theories. There is this theory of Simons, and there is another theory, quantum mechanical theory of Brinkman, Dimes, and Rao, to fit the IV characteristic to that. That's not good either. The only criterion that is left is the temperature dependence. Okay, and so the way we did is we first will establish this, and I'll go through this, and then I'll show you what happens if I take an intact versus an intentionally shorted tunnel junction, and I'll set up a new set of criteria for this, for magnetism, which is not for superconductivity. And then I'll show you what happens to the temperature dependence. Okay, so the criterion number one, now this one is an easy one. This one was really obvious. You see the resistance has to be exponential on the thickness of this barrier, divided by some number which turns out to be of the order of 1 angstrom. And this is obvious in tunneling, right? You have a very high barrier, and in order to tunnel, anybody studies in first year quantum mechanics that when you have a barrier and you tunnel through it, it goes exponentially, the dependence of that, okay? Well, so the first thing that you want to ask yourself, well, you have an insulator there is roughness, there is a distribution of pinholes. Maybe because of there is roughness, there is a distribution of pinholes, and because of this, there is a thickness-dependent distribution. So this is very easy to think about this, because look, the most trivial thing that you can think about it is the following. Is you come up with a simple growth model, use some statistical arguments. Now you can sophisticate this as much as you want, and we did do that. Eventually, we made some very complicated numerical simulations using molecular dynamics and all this. That's a smoke screen. The simplest thing, we do it from the very beginning that this will work, which is the following. Here it is. Suppose you have a conductor there, the red one, and you throw randomly some insulating blocks on it. And you ask yourself the very simple question, what is the probability for not depositing on a particular site after m attempts? The probability for that is n minus 1 divided by n to the m power. Okay? So that's the probability of leaving a hole behind, basically. If you take the limit of this when n and m go to infinity, that is to say when the area is infinite, that's an exponential. It's an exponential of minus m over n. Well, that's trivial, right? M over n is the number of deposited monolayers, so this says that the random deposition model from the very beginning gives you an exponential dependence of the tunneling. That's it. We're done. Now you can do it very complicated, I can tell you. Believe me, we published really thick PhysEd papers on this one, where you use molecular dynamics and this, and simulated annealing and all kind of crap. This is it. All that there was in it was. It's obvious from the very beginning. So I won't bore you with that part. I believe me that in the right range, of course if you go for very broad ranges in a realistic model you don't get this, but in the right range of thicknesses, which is say from 1 angstrom to 20 angstrom, this is it. Alright? Very simple. Okay, so I'll go to the criteria number one. No, doesn't prove anything. The fact that you have an exponential dependence of the resistance could be also due to roughness. This was not obvious. Surprisingly to me, 4 years ago it was not obvious to anybody. And big fights over this one. Okay, second criterion. There is two models in terms of tunneling. There is a Simons model, which assumes that the barrier is square and is symmetric. There's another model, which is Brinkman, Dimes, and Rao, which assumes that the barrier looks more like this, trapezoidal. Right? And in both of these models, they predict a dependence of the IV characteristic. So here it is a real IV characteristic, those data points there, and then it is a fit to it, you see, the green curve. And it looks like it fits. This is actually the derivative, the IDV, and it also looks like it fits. Okay, so everything fits. Right? So you can fit this model to some IV characteristic. So I'll analyze this for a second here. So here is what our approach would be. Our approach is the following. I know that if I make superconducting sample, the Raoult criteria are firm. So what I will make is I'll make some superconducting samples, I'll go at low temperature, check the Raoult criteria, see if the thing is tunneling, and I'll go to high temperature above the TC and see what is left. That's also straightforward, okay? That's you don't have to be anxious for this one. Okay, so here is the sample that we made. We made a superconducting sample, which happens to be a bilayer sample for complicated technically is on niobium aluminum. There is the oxide, aluminum oxide, and then put iron on top. Okay? And I'll show you what happens if you have two types of junctions. What they call a well-oxidized junction, which is this one, and I'll always indicate it by green, and it's going to have a J in front of it, so it's oxidized in the air for several days, and then it's glow discharged, or glow discharged. Another one, which is I call a pinhole sample, which is always indicated in red, which is oxidized in the air for 45 minutes only. Okay? We make lots of this. So it's not, mind you, it's not just one sample, it's hundreds of samples. So here it is, already, what I call the junction and what I call the short. There it is, the IV characteristic. So this is what everybody does. You look at the IV characteristic and you fit it to either the Brinkmann and Raoul Dines model or you fit it to the Simmons model, one of the two things. And notice there is a pretty good fit, I mean the fit looks very good, and there's the parameters you get. You get that the thickness of the barrier is 29 angstroms, this is above TC, and the barrier height is about half an electron volt. You know, and they don't know anything about this, so you figure half it's electron volt, it's not really electron volt, and the thickness is some angstrom, so that must be right. That's basically the approach. And here you have another thing, so what this thing called the short is also has 17 angstrom and 0.7 electron volt, so who the hell knows? I mean, this sounds okay. And this was the approach to this business. Everybody assumed that that's fine. Okay, but you see a problem came up. And the problem came up is that in my lab we have been worried about how to characterize a very thin layer, like of 10 angstrom or 20 angstrom. We spent a lot of time, and Joseph there sitting there, he knows about this one. We spent many, many years in my lab is to try to figure out how do I tell that something is 10 angstrom or 20 angstrom thick. And the problem that we came up with immediately, as soon as we grew this thin oxide, is that if you compare how much evaporation, how much you evaporate this material, or you do it by X-ray diffraction, you characterize the thickness of this barrier, and you compare that to the fits from tunneling, they disagree by about a factor of 5 to 10. So the preparation and the refinement tells me that the thickness of the barrier is 100 angstrom or 300 angstrom. The fit tells me it is only 30 angstrom. So what the hell does that mean? I don't know if I can say that. Can I say that? Or I will go to jail like Howard Stern or something. Okay? So what does that mean? It means, it obviously must mean something like the tunneling is coming from some small portion of the sample. That only tunneling occurs in the weakest point, and that's the problem with tunneling, is that it's only sensitive to the weakest point of the junction. See? That seems obvious to me. Big fights. Okay, so here it is now. I'll show you something very sensitive. So this is very sensitive. Instead of showing you the IV characteristic, which most people fit, I'll show you the DIDV, which most superconducting people fit. So I'm a superconducting guy, I'll fit the DIDV. So that is the DIDV of the junction. You see, there is the data, and that is the green curve. The data is the green curve, and the fit is that black data points. Well, so you know, it kind of fits. It gives you a thickness 28 angstrom, a barrier height of half an electron volt, and you know, a tilting of about 0.05 electron volts. If you cool this one sample down to low temperatures, the DIDV now looks like a classical tunneling curve for a good superconducting insulator normal tunnel junction. That's how this green curve is. It gives you the right gap, and everything is right. So this is a junction. This is a good junction. Notice that I'm plotting here the IDV. It is the derivative of the current with respect to voltage. Now, I haven't changed anything. What I changed is the color. The axis, I'm not playing a trick on you here, because people sometimes think that there is a trick being played. There is no trick here. Here it is now, above you see this red curve, the one that was oxidized very little. There it is again the IV characteristic. There it is a fit again. It's not a perfect fit. It wasn't a perfect fit before either, so you know, who knows. I get the thickness of the barrier, which is, you know, again 17 angstrom, who the hell knows, but I mean, I don't know. So 17 angstrom, 20 angstrom, same thing. A barrier height of half an electron volt, so that sounds also more or less plausible. And you know, some slope to that. Look at here what happened to the DIDV. The DIDV, I haven't changed the axis on you. Before the center went down, now the center goes up. This ain't accident, as we say scientifically. It ain't an accident because this is not tunneling. This is actually superconducting. If you have superconductor normal metal contact, it's called Andreev reflection. I haven't changed the axis. If I would have changed the axis and would have plotted the VDI, that would be a trick. I haven't done that. It's the IDV, still the same. Alright, just to convince you. See the IDV? See the IDV. Alright? And in this case the thing goes down, in this case the thing goes up. Now this is no accident. There's no accident. The reason that this is red is because of that. See? This looks like a short. It looks like a contact, a metallic contact, a superconducting contact against a normal material. Trivial. Okay? Well, there is all kinds of things you can say about this Andreev reflection. I don't want to bore you. This actually was used, for those of you guys that don't know about this, this was used actually to measure the spin polarization of the electrodes in, on all kind of things. Okay, so criterion number 3. So here this criterion number 3, again I do the same thing. I know where the Raoul tells me when the thing is a tunnel junction, then I look at criterion number 3, which is the temperature dependence of the resistance. And then you see, now I gain here something. Because invariably, if it is a junction, you see that dependence, which is a negative temperature dependence of the resistance. If it's a short, it looks like this. It looks positive. This looks like an insulator. This looks like a metal. And this, we have seen this now in more than 100 samples or 200 samples. I don't even know how many. And all investigated samples show 100% correlation with this thing. That's why I claim that the criterion that is important is the temperature dependence of the resistance. 100% correlation. There was not one exception to this rule. That may be actually pathological, now that I think about it. Okay, so conclusion of part number 1. The 3 remaining Raoult criteria were tested. 2 criteria were found unreliable, and the exponential thickness dependence is not right, the nonlinear IV curves are not right. And so there is one thing that is right, which is temperature dependence. That's reliable. Okay? Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to go and look, how do I tell that I'm normal? I mean, this is superconductivity. Nobody gives a damn about superconductivity. Jorge Kirsch is not here, so I can insult him all I want. So, so basically, who cares? Right? I mean, so I want to go to the real magnetic tunnel junction and see what to do. And so what we did then is we got together with Motorola, where we actually looked at their own tunnel junctions that they use in their magnetic random access memory. So there's actual devices. They gave it to us, and then we introduced shorts intentionally into them. So that was not something good for your telephones, but it was good for our research. And then we studied the temperature and bias dependence of the resistance and the magnetoresistance, and then we compared before and after. And that's what allows us to set up a new set of criteria. Okay, so here it is. This is the MRAM, the magnetic random access memory samples from Motorola. You have a layer, again remember, there's a clean layer, there is aluminum oxide, and there's a free layer. Exactly the same thing as I was telling you before. This happened to be some permalloy and cobalt alloys and some glass MOSFETs and aluminum and blah blah, all these things, okay? And in all the junctions that we looked from Motorola that were using their phones, they had weakly insulating like temperature dependence, which what it means here for all of you guys now, tunneling. Right? Everybody's now convinced that this is tunneling. So that's tunneling. And the magnetoresistance was very high, about 36%, with the thickness of the barrier, 9 angstroms, actually is amazing. And the barrier height was about 1.7 electronvolts. So we took the original device, we applied a voltage force, and we shorted it. You see, you applied zap it, and then it shorts. That's no big surprise. Anybody that works in a lab like this knows that if you don't do things right, you short it. You can short junctions out, and then I get all pissed off over this thing, right? So here it is what happens. So here it is the first, the temperature, what happens to the temperature dependence. There is the resistance, the function of temperature. There it is the virgin junction. See, there it is. Okay, so this is in the parallel, is when the 2 spins are pointing like this of the junction and in the anti-parallel direction. Those are the 2 green curves there. So that's a good junction characteristic for the real parallel direction, the anti-parallel direction. The dependence as function of temperature is insulating like. It looks like a good tunnel junction. And now what you do is you short it, you zap it. I mean, it's a very uncontrolled kind of a thing, but you zap it, you know what can happen. It's not going to become better. It becomes worse, you see. The temperature dependent, the resistance drops, it does exactly what you expect it to do. When you short it, you make a small little metallic contact. The small little metallic contact has a lower resistance, and it has a different a different temperature dependence, the opposite of this one. Okay? And then if you short it again, it does again the same thing. So you go here, you short it, you go there, zap it, and you see this kind of behavior. So this is great. It does exactly what you would expect it to do. Okay? And now comes to the question about the temperature dependency. Here it is where the thing is. If you take the junction and you measure its temperature dependency, there it is an RDI, or this in this case is the VDI. There it is the DVDI, and there it is the DVDI for the short. And notice that first of all, the very first thing that you notice here in the temperature dependence is that if you look at the temperature dependence at zero bias, the temperature dependence goes down as you are increasing the temperature. Here, the temperature dependence goes up as you're increasing the temperature. And most of the temperature dependence, there's very little temperature dependence here at finite bias. There's a lot of temperature dependence in the short at finite bias. And that's exactly what you'd expect again. And I'll show you in a second why it is exactly what you would expect again. Now let me just remind you that the reason that I'm making a big deal out of this is because this business about the temperature dependence, there's a lot was made out of this. There's many papers written in the literature about this effect here. I mean, you won't believe the kind of things that they've invented. They've invented surface magnons, which don't exist in nature. Nobody, they just made up, somebody made up this thing of surface magnons, and I tried to inquire if anybody knows what the hell a surface magnon is. And I have not been able, but they make up this because they have to explain this. Well, I'll show you what this thing is in just 1 second. It has, again, a very simple explanation, like most of this field. Okay, so here is what well, you can go through this exercise, to feed the barrier heights, and you see this is what happens. If you feed the average barrier height, it changes the temperature in this way, the barrier height. The barrier width, it also changes that way. On the other hand, the short does the opposite. Okay, so when you zap it, the things switch around and they do the opposite from each other. So what happens? The apparent barrier height decreases and the apparent barrier width increases. Okay, so there's a stronger and a reverse temperature dependence when you zap this thing. Okay, so the short gives you a stronger temperature dependence. All right. So what happens to the magnetoresistance? So that is the magnetoresistance, the measurement, which is the interesting thing. If you look at the magnetoresistance decreases, but the shorts have no magnetoresistance. So if you make shorts, you zap this junction, and you look at the magnetoresistance, there is no additional magnetoresistance that is added to this. As if this ballistic magnetoresistance, God knows where it comes from, or I mean, it's not related to this one. It doesn't appear here. Now this data that I'm showing you was invoked by the ballistic magnetoresistance guys as support for their theory of what's going on there. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying there is no additional magnetoresistance added here by the shorts. And the shape of the magnetoresistance, you see, is insensitive to zapping. Okay? So the shape doesn't change, you see it again. It's as if you would have two resistors in parallel. You have a short, which is a metal, it doesn't do much, and this tunnel junction, which has a magnetoresistance. So the shape doesn't change, okay, because of that. Because the shape comes all from this tunneling magnetoresistance. Now we'll notice that there is some noise here, and I think that noise actually is important, and that noise has to do with the fact, well, okay, so let me just tell you this first. So the resistance versus temperature metal, like at all bias levels, the apparent barrier height decreases and apparent width increases with decreasing temperature, and there is excessive noise and instability at low bias. That's not something good, incidentally, for applications. If you want to have a telephone, you don't want to have this noise there. So I mean, you get all this stuff if your phone does that kind of thing, so you don't want that. And so that's actually an important thing. You don't want shorts in your and the reason for that is very simple. It has to do with heating or electromigration. We're not sure exactly which one of those. But if you do a simple calculation of how many shorts you have, and you can calculate this very easily by just comparing resistances, and you do all that calculation, you find out that the current is huge. It's about 10 to the 10 amps per square centimeter flowing there. Huge current flowing to those shorts. And that's what gives rise to the noise. Okay? Okay, so here is the conclusion of what I told you so far. I told you that that we looked at this criteria, that the new tunneling criteria were formulated, and the nanocontacts reduce the resistance per area as you expected. And then we investigated nanocontacts that they do not add any magnetoresistance, and they may suffer from very high current densities if you have a very thin contact there. And that's actually important even for this ballistic magnetoresistance independent of this, because you put a current through this. Think about it. You have 10 to the 10 amps through something. That's a huge current. Okay? Okay, so now what I want to tell you is about the origin of the temperature dependence. Okay? So, so basically, here it is. Again, for those of you that don't have very much resistance to listening to talks, and it's already starting to come close to the end of my talk, which is the following. Here it is what I tell you. I tell you that thermal smearing, which is an obvious effect that is there in all tunnel junctions, explains 90 or 95% of the temperature dependence. There is no mystery in this thing. There is some temperature dependence which is not known what it originates from, but 90% or 95% of the temperature dependence is explained by well-known, well-established tunneling things. There is no way out of this one. Okay? So here is what the motivation is, that there was all kind of strange temperature dependencies, and so people were wondering, what does it come from? And here it is what you see. You see these curves, and as you see these curves, as you're increasing the temperature, the resistance, notice here there is a sharp structure in this particular tunneling junction, and the structure gets smeared out. It kind of gets rounded off. And the question is, where does this rounding off come? Where does this slight dependency comes from, and so on. Okay? So this is the main thing actually that happens, is the rounding off of the shaft. So how did we do this? We took these telephones from Motorola and we took them apart. Actually, we didn't do them. And then what we measured the VDI versus voltage for a high temperature and low temperature in the parallel and anti-parallel direction. And see what happens. Okay, that's sort of the trivial kind of experiment. It's not as easy as I'm describing it, but conceptually it's not anything. And here it is what happens. So here it is a sample that has a low resistance, R times A low, 1.3 kilo ohms per millimeter square, whatever the hell that units mean. It is a sample with a large, 24 kilo ohms per millimeter square. And this is in the two situations that you have here. You have the parallel, the anti-parallel, the spin of one electron points up and the other one points down. Here it is in the parallel, both spins point up. Okay? And so now I have to write down some equations, which is unfortunate because I'm going to write down the equations just at the end of the talk. And that's when everybody's kind of trying to keep awake, trying to get themselves from falling asleep. But that's unfortunately, this is when it comes in here. Here it is the tunneling. This is the tunneling, the IV characteristic, how the IV characteristic from a tunnel junction should come. If you look and you ask yourself, how does the tunneling occur? You have to have a denser of states on the left-hand side, and there has to be an empty denser of states on the right-hand side. There has to be, the barrier height has to enter there, and it turns out the smearing of these denser of states here at the Fermi function enters there. At the end of the whole story, you end up with this equation. That the dIdV is proportional to some matrix element, which tells you how the electrons move from here to there. Tells you the denser of states of the left electron, the denser of states on the right electrons, and because you're taking the derivative here, which is the sensitive part, then you have a derivative of the Fermi function here. And then there is the second term which I will neglect for the moment, so I won't talk about it. So there's two terms actually. But I neglect this term, and that's what most people neglect, the second term. Okay, so here it is. So t equal to 0, the denser of states is sharp. There's a Fermi function there. At t larger than 0, do something like this, is smeared there. And so the derivative of the Fermi function is peaked, right? It has a peak. So what we will do is the following, is we'll just assume that the low temperature data, which is at 5 degrees Kelvin, is the same as t equals 0. And then we convolute the low temperature data. So this is the low temperature data there. That's the part of the low temperature. And we'll convolute it to the FdV, to this function, which we know what the functional form of that thing is. That's, again, no Einstein for anything that I'm telling you here. This is all trivial stuff if you studied anything about quantum mechanics. Right? So that all you have to know is that this function, when you're at t equal to 0, the derivative of the Fermi function is a delta function. So when you put a delta function there, you just end up with m times n times n. That's it. So you can take the 0 temperature data, which is this one, convolute it with this one, and see what happens. Okay? That's called thermal smearing. Okay? And so independently of anything else, the curve shape, the mechanism, anything, independently of anything else, thermal smearing must be there. If you increase the temperature, things get smeared, that's it. There is nothing. Already Sherlock Holmes did know this. Okay? It's clear. Okay? So there is no way to hear, you can't interpret data without taking this damn thing into account. This is what is totally irritating to people that do tunneling that for a long time. That you go to this magnetism meeting, and you find that people actually are reinventing the wheel again. And they do, I'm not going to worry about thermal smearing. Well, you can't. It's impossible not to worry about it. It's right there, it has to be there. There's no way out of it. Okay, so again, what I do is I take the dIdV, the experimentally measure the dIdV, I take the dIdV which I experimentally measure, or I didn't, Igor measure it experimentally, and we convolute it to the derivative of the Fermi function. That's it, that's all we do. And we compare that, and now remember that in order to do this, we get a smear temperature here. So here it is what happens. Remember, we neglected the second term. That's important actually. So there it is. So there it is. We take the zero temperature data and we convolute it with the spinning of the Fermi function. And whether you're in the parallel direction or the anti-parallel direction, it doesn't matter. The fit is excellent. And the thermal spinning has to be there. All right? There's a problem. There's a slight problem actually. The problem is the following, is that you know this is the temperature that you have to use for smearing. And this is the actual experimental temperature. That's the problem. The problem here is that the slope here is not 1, it's 2, roughly. And you know, it varies a little bit whether in the parallel or anti-parallel direction. What that means is that the thermal spinning temperature that you have to use is not the actual temperature of the junction, and that's a problem. And we had all kind of theories to explain this, but until actually Igor pointed out that we have neglected a term. Okay? We neglect that term, which is everybody neglects it, so we'll neglect it. Well, you can't. Turns out you can't. You have to include that term there. Okay? So we have to include the second term, and if you include the second term, then that's it. You're successful. The fit and it's equal to the experimental data. So here it is the thing. Here it is without the second term, there it is the fit. You see the fit is excellent without the second term. You don't need that damn second term. So forget about it. And the fit, but there is this problem that the fit that you get twice the experimental temperature. Well, you forget about it. You fit it with the second term and then it's good. No problem. Okay, so you don't do what everybody does in this field. You just kind of include the second term. Okay, so what are the conclusion? I told you that thermal spinning is 95% of the temperature dependence. I mean, whatever is left is this temperature dependence. You see, there is a constant temperature dependence there that we cannot explain. That is not explained. It's not an IV. It's not a temperature dependence. This temperature dependence, this change here, these curves are shifted. And that's not explained. But the rest of it, the change of the shape and how this thing varies with temperature, that's all explained. 95%. And insofar as these curves explain it, I mean, anything is pretty well. Okay? And including the second term makes the smear temperature to be equal to the experimental temperature. There's some open question because there is a shift along the VDI axis. And there is some models that you have to use for this, and then there is a lot of models for finite temperatures. But I'm telling you that there is a problem. All these models that have been applied, they have not been applied properly. Because what people did is they applied it to the whole junction without including thermal smearing, and you cannot do that. Right? And this was a big fight over, until, people just gave up. I don't know if they gave up due to my aggressivity or they gave up because it's right, but so they gave up. Okay? And so, there's all kind of theories and how this happens, and I'm not sure what the end result of this is because this has not been solved. Okay, so what I told you now is that thermal smearing must be included independently of what kind of, fancy thing you have. All right? What kind of theory you have, and whatever theories that you have, whichever theory you have is your favorite one, you have to include the thermal smearing. Right? So I caution you that if you look into this field, and some of you may have looked into this, you have to be careful. Okay, so what's in the future of this whole field? So there's a bunch of very bright future for this, believe it or not, which is the following. First of all, you can ask yourself, what happens if you have magnetic states in the barrier? Okay, that's an interesting question that actually was addressed in the case of superconductors. In this case, it hasn't been actually, to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't been done. Okay, so if you put, for instance, a magnetic ion in the tunnel junction, you have a real tunneling, and you have a tunneling process that things jump through this magnetic state, or this magnetic state, it points up or points down, or points with respect to the electrode. That's an important issue. Another thing is that you can think of externally tunable barriers. You can think of a barrier that you stick in there that you can actually tune externally. What I mean by that is you can change the barrier height maybe externally. And there is ways of doing that. Actually, the way to do that, one way of doing that is, for instance, there are these materials like transition metal oxides that have huge changes of the resistivity with all kinds of stimuli, magnetic fields or with light or with all kinds of things. So you can change the barrier height, so you can make tunable tunneling. And actually, this was explored in the superconducting case. I don't think it's been explored in the magnetic case. Harry Soule actually and I have been talking about this. Harry came up with this idea of doing something called the spin drag. This has nothing to do with the ladies that are in San Francisco. has to do with the fact that if you attach an electrode in on one of the layers and you put a current in the other layer, you may have a spin polarized drag. The spins may drag the spins on one layer, may drag the spins on the other layer. This actually was observed in semiconductor layers. In semiconductor layers, there has been phonon drag being observed, or Coulomb drag. Both of these have been observed in semiconductor, but not with spin. So this is another possibility. There's magnetic proximity across the junction, and Casey Miller, that's sitting there, right there, he is slating over this for a few months now. Basically, that it is based on the theory that Bouchard came up with, is that if you have a tunnel junction and put two magnetic electrodes and you put a current through something that's below these two magnetic electrodes, although the current doesn't go through the magnetic electrodes, the magnetic proximity to this current in a normal metal gives rise to a spin polarized current, a spin polarized signature. So if the two electrodes are pointing like this versus the two electrodes pointing like this gives rise to a spin polarized current, and maybe gives rise to a device. There's a theory by Lou Shao, which we are trying to look if there's any way to explore that one. And here's another one. There is Corneliu Kolesniuk and Bert Fruberger that are doing this one. Now this one is a real good one, because I went to the match meeting. We started working on these organic materials in my new lab, and I went. The one thing at the match meeting that there was a lot of excitement was about these organic things. You put an organic, instead of putting aluminum oxide, you put an organic material in the barrier. The whole thing that I told you now, it's repeated all over again in that field. You sit there, I sit there, and the little hair that I have, I try to pull it off, because all these people are claiming claims about tunneling and this and that without having any evidence for it. So I know what this is great, because I can go back, pull out the briefcase again, open it. I don't even have to think about it. As I say, as somebody said, with half of my brain time behind my back, I can do this thing all over again. And so I'm going to repeat this whole story all over again for this organic tunneling. Because 90% of what was going on there is nonsense. Because they don't know if it's tunneling. They just think that they put down some organic crap, and that's tunneling. That's it. Okay? And so if you want to know about the publications, there is a list there, but I won't bore you with reading you everything there. Thank you.
Questions? So, what do you think about the prospect of combining that organic tunneling stuff with the tuning, like with these signing?
That's a lot of question, of course, because you think that I actually am sold on that one. The problem is, you see, that the one way of tuning things in the barrier is with light, and so you have to get the light in there into the middle of the junction. But there's another way of tuning the thing is with magnetic field. And so I think that's a very good prospect, actually. So I think that, we are doing basic research, and I couldn't care less if this is useful for anything. So as far as I'm concerned, if we can do some interesting effect, and you can find some interesting effect, then that's good enough for me. So I think the prospects are actually quite good. So, yeah.
When you have a pinhole and it's actually short, why don't you see a little bit of ballistic?
Everybody has the half question. Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know. Okay, so the simple answer is I don't know. Okay. The more complicated answer is the following: there could be many reasons why you don't see it. One reason why you maybe not see it is because when you have a short, then there's a lot of scattering there, and so it's not ballistic, first of all. But there could be another reason, is that the only way the ballistic magnetoresistance works is if you have an infinitely sharp domain wall there, so that the moments here point this way. Okay. This tells me to shut up. So the moments here point this way, the moments on the other side of the barrier point that way. That's how these guys that invented this whole ballistic magnetoresistance thought about it. Now, I have a doubt about this, and you clear it up for me. If I take let's say a magnetic material looks like this, has more moments pointing that way. They never point that way, because here they start pointing, near the surface, and here they point near the surface. And once I put them in contact, will the magnetic moments continue pointing the way they pointed when they were separate? I doubt it. Of course, I have no evidence. Neither do they. But I have no evidence, and I would believe that if you put them in contact like this, the magnetic fields will be distorted, the domain will become smooth enough, and it will become adiabatic. This electron is going to come along, and instead of seeing a sharp, an infinitely sharp magnetic domain wall, it will see something very smooth, and it's going to turn around, like this, very smooth.
We talked about this before, if you had a really high crystalline and isotopy.
Listen, who is it? Maribel, listen to this, because what he said, I haven't told you this, but he told me this already.
If you had a really strong and isotopy, you would get a very sharp domain wall, and maybe,
So maybe it's worthwhile. So in fact,
maybe not.
well, maybe not, right. But in fact, most of people, what they try to do is they try to do it in the opposite limit. They try to do it with permaloid, which has exactly the opposite. Okay, so most of them,
can be permaloid, but at least the other one.
yeah, but it's not, because I mean, to make this contact, okay? And I mean, as of today, I know of an experiment where people have, and there's all kind of crazy things. Now, I can tell you this, that the ballistic magnetoresistance, I hear rumors to the fact that that work, BMR, has been able to collect $10 million of venture capital. So, you know, talk about me being stupid. I mean, here I'm criticizing this. Somebody got $10 million.
So ballistic magnetoresistance does work.
It does work. It works very well. At the tune of $10 million. Got it, yeah.
Well, do you have some estimate of the size of the pinholes in the intentionally shorted junctions? Because I mean, I think of typically when you short something like that, it's a pretty gross, you know, shorted. It's a big feature, whereas the BMR I was under the impression was tiny contact areas.
Okay, so let me tell you this. Actually, I also, the short answer to your question, I don't know. But the longer answer, there is a longer answer to this one. The longer answer is this. Well, there is a simple answer. The simple answer is you ask Igor, because he's talked about this more than I did. So, you know, he can tell you something. But I'll tell you about the ballistic magnetoresistance. I thought about that a lot. The way the ballistic magnetoresistance originally was done is taking two humongous structures and bring them together. So you're talking about one, like a building, and bring it together with a point like this. Okay? And so they were millimeter sized, and they were presumably, they had no evidence for this, there was nowhere any evidence for this. Presumably there was a one atom contact there.
That's not, I mean, they saw quantization in the
No. In the original data, the problem with this field, if you come to my talk tomorrow, I'll talk about this one because that's pathological science. Exactly. What happens is that in the original data, in a few series of papers, like 5 or 6 of them, they showed what the resistance of this ballistic magnetoresistance is, and the effect was there. When this thing came under very heavy attack, it came under the shock and awe, as Bush would say, okay? Then they started backing off, and then they started inventing new things, but like quantized things. But this has been observed before without quantized things, okay? And the resistances were comparable. Now, let me assume that that original work is all wrong, but the new work is correct. If you look at the quantized thing also, you have to ask the question. You have to look at the data, not at the steps that they draw into the data. If you look at the data, I venture to make a bet that there is more steps in between quantized than there is steps on the quantized. You see, it's a pathological sense. If you're drawing steps into a data, your eye somehow gets drawn to those steps. And then you tend to believe it. So I don't believe that either. And the third thing is, very good, the last magnetism, if you will.
Yeah.
Well, did you see this thing that Egerhoff was saying, that if you look at this what's it called, this electroplating thing, that as you're applying magnetic fields or voltages to this thing, crap moves in and out in the electroplating solution, and it shorts the things out, and it gives rise to all kind of crazy things. I mean, this stuff is very pathological. As far as I'm concerned, unless you can make some structure which is reproducible from lab to lab, and it's reproducible within the same lab, and it's reproducible, you know, with the magnetic fields and this and that, then it's invalid. That's it. That's what I would say. If it can only be done in one lab, and it has to be done either in a lab in sunny Buffalo or in Madrid, in one lab in Madrid, then that's it. I don't believe it.
So do you think with the pinholes,
Yeah.
suppose that you're able to make one pinhole, or you have one pinhole on
Yeah.
Is it possible in that kind of structure to see?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, that if you could make, I
No,
think,
okay, well, hold on. So
Yeah.
can you see the quantization of
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you can see quantization, sure. In small structures, you can see quantization. But in stable small structures, I mean, people have looked at quantization in small structures, but not in taking a wire of 1 millimeter, sharpening it with a knife, and then pushing them together and seeing this quantization. Yeah, I've seen. And if you look at the draw, I mean, I've seen some papers lately that are unbelievable. They show a structure that looks like this. Okay, so a structure like this, just like this thing here, all right? And then another structure, a similar one like this. The scale here is one micron, like this. And then they show the contact like this, and they say that's 1 atom. You go, what the hell are you talking about? I just totally fail to understand. Okay? And it is really, I feel totally stupid because it's, you know, you ask like kind of stupid questions. I can answer better this question about how many pinholes there are or not. Because you can't, because all you know is the ratio of the resistance. So you don't know, you know, it could be that all the short is in one place or all the shorts are distributed. So it's very hard to tell that. But depending on how the shorts are distributed, of course, this is going to have an important effect on the performance of the. So it has a real applied importance, but I have no idea. But there is a paper recently that I've seen that it's exactly like this, and with a scale of 1 micron, which is about this size, and they claim it's 1 atom. You look and say, well, I see an atom is very small. It's 10,000 times smaller. So I don't know, maybe it's there.
Well, let us thank you again.